Bury Crump, the odd spot of bother. Chapter 1, A Long Story. A 4-year-old bay gelding called Battle Barb won the magistrate's handicap by a short head, and 200 miles away, a man called Harry Long collected $46.35 from a fat bookmaker in a hotel bar. That night, Harry Long took home, of all things, a bottle of square gin, and he and his wife celebrated their win, and 8 months, 1 week, and 2 nights later, their son Harry was born. Old Harry Long reckoned that the only decent name to call a boy was Harry, and he'd be damned if he was going to call a boy of his anything else. He had 2 sons, both named Harry. There were 2 other children in the family, both girls, and both called Sarah. Old Harry Long reckoned that the only decent name to call a girl was Sarah, and he'd be damned if he was going to call a girl of his anything else. With the girls, the resulting confusion was partly remedied by calling the elder one Old Sarah and the other one Young Sarah. Unfortunately, this wouldn't work with the boys, because Old Harry had always been known as Old Harry, and he'd be damned if he was going to let a boy of his swipe his name. It was the neighborhood kids who settled the matter in the finish. The shorter of the young Harry Longs became known as Short Harry Long, and his brother automatically became Long Harry Long. And so there was Old Harry Long and his wife, who rejoiced in the Christian name of Lillian Sue, and the 2 boys, Short Harry Long and Long Harry Long, and the girls, Old Sarah Long and Young Sarah Long. I might as well tell you right now that the only one of them who's got anything whatever to do with this yarn is Long Harry Long, otherwise it could get a bit tricky to follow. Now, Long Harry Long wasn't what you'd call enraptured with the name he'd been given in the first place, so he didn't particularly mind when they tacked the nickname Wendy on to him about halfway through primary school, and Wendy Long he stayed, except on official forms and things, for which he always gave his name as Harold W. Long. That's his name more or less sorted out. His appearance wasn't so easy to deal with. You see, Wendy wasn't exactly what you'd call a good-looking bloke. For one thing, his ears were a scrap on the large side and stuck out from his head like a pair of handles to pick him up with. This temptation tended to be too much for some of the bigger boys at school. His physique wasn't all that wonderful either. It looked as though Wendy had been taken from a box of spare parts and put together in the dark by someone who wasn't going to get any extra for making a decent job of it. His shoulders slopped gently down from his neck with a fall of about 2 in 1. He had no hips or backside to speak of, or hold his pants up, and his pockets were always bulging with hands and bits of junk that were interesting to nobody but Wendy, except perhaps his mother, who was always getting things like clock parts and pen nibs and lambing rubbers caught in the washing machine wringer. Wendy was always a bit of a strange bloke. People found it difficult to know what to make of him. He's the only boy I've ever seen who can get himself into trouble while he's sitting still with his mouth shut, said a schoolteacher once, and yet in some ways he's one of the brightest kids in the school for his age, and the dumbest, added another teacher. I suppose he means well, sighed a slightly distracted aunt. He's so willing to pitch in and help that he doesn't give himself time to think before he does it, reported the headmaster. He's dogged with bad luck, that boy, said an uncle. He does it on purpose, shouted a neighbor who'd been incautious enough to erect a glass house. He doesn't tell lies, his mother used to say. It's just that he sometimes gets the truth a little mixed up. He's a genius, announced a postmistress, who hardly knew him. He's nuts, said one of his sisters. He's not, said his other sister. That boy is so accident-prone it can't be safe to even stand near him, said the district nurse. But if he survives to grow up, he'll be tough. It's not fair, complained the storekeeper. You've got to hand it to him all the same, said old Harry Long, squinting at the hopeless jigsaw of components that only that morning had been a rotary hoe with a dirty spark plug. I give up, said the majority, and they did. However, Wendy and his school teachers and his family managed to stick it out until he was old enough to leave school. They gave him a pretty fair sort of a write-up in his final report, all things considered. One of his teachers, bless her, even said she was sorry to see him go. Wendy knew he wouldn't be encouraged to stay and work at home. Quite apart from anything else, there wasn't enough work to keep his old man and his brother going full-time. He was keen to get out and see a bit of the world anyway, like most young blokes his age. He started looking around for a job, but no one in the district was game to take him on, so he decided to try further afield. Chapter 2. A Bit of a Lean Spell. A joker called Ossie Brunton cut his hand on a circular saw, collected his compo, and traveled south with a bloke he met in the pub. They pinched a car in Christ Church, got picked up by the cops in Amaru, and Ossie Brunton ended up doing 18 months for conversion. That's all he's got to do with us. Anyone who'd deliberately shove his hand into a circular saw just to get the compo doesn't deserve to get put in a book anyway. The only reason I mentioned him at all was because Wendy Long got the job, cutting up mill slabs into firewood after Ossie Brunton left, and 2 weeks after he started, he ran into a spot of bother. He accidentally cut his hand in the same saw when a lump of knotty pine jammed on him. It wasn't a very serious cut. In fact, the boss was more upset about it than either Wendy or the doctor who patched it up for him. "I've had a gutful of you careless bastards," he said. "You're not getting any more bloody compo out of me. I'll cut the bloody stuff myself from now on." "What do you want me to do, boss?" said Wendy. "Just keep right out of my bloody way. That's what I want you to do. You should everything you've touched since you came here. If I catch you anywhere near the place again, I'll shove you fair through one of the saw blades you've ruined for me." "In that case, I might as well leave," said Wendy. "That's right," said the boss. "You might as well. You're not working here anymore, I can tell you that." Wendy hadn't been working long enough for him to have saved a bit of money to keep him going, till he could jack himself up another job. So he had to take the first thing he could get at a place where they made concrete posts, but it turned out that he was no good at it. The boss was a patient enough bloke, but after a few days he decided that it was cheaper to give Wendy a week's pay in lieu of notice and let him go, than to keep him on any longer. Actually, Wendy was inclined to agree with the decision. It's a sheer waste of time, working at something you're not suited for. There were so many other jobs he could have been doing, jobs where he could get somewhere. But jobs weren't as easy to come by as he'd expected. And Wendy ended up just about on the bones of his backside and stuck in a little country place where a job he'd heard about had fallen through on him. But Wendy wasn't the kind of bloke to let it get him down, and he pestered George Stack the blacksmith into offering him a temporary job, which Wendy accepted on the spot. He also gratefully accepted old George's offer of the use of a spare bunk in the hut he lived in behind the smithy. Wendy got on very well there. He turned the handle of the blower on the forge and held things while old George fixed or shod or shaped them. George wasn't much of a one for talking, but Wendy soon got to know what to pass him and when to pass it, and when things were a bit slack, he'd do a bit of repair work on the shed they worked in, while old George sat on a box in front of the forge, marking his racing guide with the carpenter's pencil he kept in his waistcoat pocket. And one day, when he was up on the roof blocking leaks, Wendy heard old George tell a dairy farmer he was welding something for that the young coots handy to have around sometimes. By the time he'd been there for 2.5 months, Wendy was doing most of the small engineering and welding jobs that came in. Old George increased his wages to between $20 and $35 a week without saying anything about it, and Wendy was even allowed to have a go at some of the easier horses that they brought in to be shod. People were even beginning to ask his advice when old George was doing something else or taking his time over getting round to attending to them. It was the best job Wendy had ever had, and he lost it quite by accident. It was sheer bad luck, really. George had a rickety wooden privy perched across the top of a big hole up the far end of his section. The door was down at the workshop, with all the spare nuts and bolts spread out on it so they could be sorted through more easily, and the toilet couldn't be used during the daytime because it was on a slight rise and looked out over the town and both roads that led to it. And at night, the journey was a bit hazardous because you had to pick your way through all the heaps of overgrown clumps of rusty farm machinery and heaps of junk George had dumped there over the years. There was a big battery hand light for them to use when they went up there. Old George was quite particular about that light and always made sure that Wendy turned it off properly and put it back in its right place by the door whenever he used it. This night Wendy grabbed the torch and found his way out to the aforementioned establishment. Now he wasn't being careless or anything. In fact, he always switched the torch off when he got there and put it carefully on the seat beside him. Until he was ready to go back through the yard, and yet somehow the damned thing managed to accidentally fall in just after he'd switched it off. This was a bit awkward. Wendy had a sneaking idea that if he couldn't recover the torch and put it back in good going order, old George was going to be pretty cut up. He was a bit high-strung about the thing. Wendy groped around in the yard until he found a tangle of fencing wire he knew was there. He twisted off about 15 feet of it and returned to the problem, where he began hooking around for the torch, about 7 or 8 feet down. It was pretty hopeless because he couldn't see what he was doing, so he stumbled back down to the hut and managed to smuggle a box of matches and some old newspapers out without old George even looking up from his race book. Back at the scene of operations, he put a match to a double page of newspaper and dropped it in, and just before it burned itself out, he thought he saw the torch over near one side. He lit some more paper and stood by with his wire hook, but the paper seemed to have dropped on top of where he thought the torch was lying. He lit some more paper and hooked around a bit. He lit more paper, tore some of it off because it was too much, and dropped it in. But some of the paper he tore off must have been alight, because while he was looking and hooking, the rest of the newspaper behind him caught fire. By the time he turned round, one dry wooden wall of old George's lavatory was well and truly alight. He kicked at it a few times and poked the flames with his piece of wire, and then the heat and hopelessness drove him out into the yard. There was enough light from the blazing lavatory for him to see his way right down to the hut where old George was standing, temporarily speechless in the doorway. His first roar stopped Wendy in his tracks about 20 feet from the hut. He turned out to be very high-strung about his torch indeed. The volume, duration, and range of the abuse he slung at Wendy, along with all his belongings, were more than Wendy felt the occasion warranted. The fire at the far end of the yard had burned down to a faint glow, and a few rising sparks by the time old George had left off enough steam. He slammed the hut door and left Wendy to retrieve his scattered belongings. Wendy sneaked into the workshop and spent the rest of the night huddled against the dying heat of the forge. He nipped away early in the morning to get a lift with the carrier as far as his milk run went, and by that night Wendy was sleeping in a comfortable bed in a hotel, with enough money to keep himself afloat for a while. Wendy had a bit of a lean spell for a while after that. His money didn't last out as well as he'd hoped, and he had to take odd jobs wherever he could get them. He covered a lot of country during those months. It was sheer good luck that he rang up in answer to an advertisement in a newspaper and landed the job on Fred Neville's sheep farm. His new boss met him off the bus and drove him the last 40 miles of the journey along, down, through, up, around, and alongside a washed-out stony road to the farm. It was a really comfortable place to live and work, and it looked as though Wendy was going to be able to settle at last into a permanent job. The Nevilles were so easygoing and friendly, it was hard to imagine anything could go wrong. Of course, there were one or two little setbacks at first. For one thing, Wendy got a bit of a crush on both the boss's daughters at first sight. It wasn't a very serious thing, but it had quite an effect on Wendy, mainly because he'd never really had much contact with women and didn't know how to handle them. The girls were helping out on the farm temporarily. There was Dawn, the oldest, who was short and plump, and Sally, a year younger. She was short and plump too. He had a bit of trouble identifying which was which at first, but that didn't make much difference. If either of them spoke to him or even looked at him, he could only shuffle and stammer. Both of them at once rendered him almost speechless. At the time, he had a limp and a slight speech impediment he'd picked up from a bloke he'd been digging bulrushes with, and that didn't help at all. The girls pretty soon concluded that he wasn't very bright and largely ignored him, which made it a bit easier, but then he accidentally went and got a bit of a crush on the boss's wife, who was also short and plump. The whole family was short and plump. No one suspected that Wendy had a crush on 3/4 of the Neville family, which was just as well for him. It was bad enough it happening, without them finding out about it. Not that he did anything about it, mind you. No poems or gamboling around the paddocks with the lambs or anything like that. He just muttered a bit when he thought he was on his own and kicked his feet through the dust around the sheep yards. The nearest he ever got to saying anything personal to one of them was one day when Sally and he were pressing a bale of dags in the woolshed, and she suddenly said, "How come you call yourself Wendy? It's not your proper name, is it?" "It's my school name," he replied. "I'm a coward." He could have kicked himself the moment he'd said it, but she'd caught him by surprise, and from the attitude of the others during the next few days, it was pretty obvious that Sally hadn't considered what he told her to be confidential. After a month, there was no improvement. His crush switched from one of the 3 women to another, whichever was the closest at any time. And on top of that, he had an idea that the boss was getting a bit jealous because of his dogs having taken a shine to Wendy. They just wouldn't stop hanging around him. There was nothing he could do about it, because if he belted them, the boss would probably go crook. He was a bit high-strung about his dogs. However, apart from these minor aspects, it was by far the best job he'd had for months. "Can you drive a car, Wendy?" said the boss one night after dinner. Yep, he could too. A new truck I've had on order for a while has finally arrived. I'll have to go over to Clinton and pick it up. Do you think you could come with me and drive the car back?" "Yeah, sure." "We'll have to stay the night in Clinton and come back the next day. That okay with you?" "Good as gold," said Wendy. He'd never been to a city the size of Clinton. "Okay," said the boss. "We'll get away first thing in the morning. I'll give you a call." They left a couple of hours before dawn and crossed the ranges. The road was open, but there was still a lot of slush and snow about. Clinton was a bit overwhelming. There was just time when they got there for them to take delivery of the new truck and book into a hotel for a meal. Next morning they went shopping for a big list of things the boss's wife had ordered them to get. The new truck was just a cab and chassis, so they loaded all the stuff into the car. It filled the back to level with the top of the front seat. They threw a few presents in on top to be left off at a neighbor's place till next Christmas. Then they set off for home, Wendy driving the loaded car and the boss following slowly in the new truck, which had to be run in. In an hour, Wendy was getting used to handling the car. It was easy. He was so far ahead by this time that he decided to stop and wait for the boss, who caught up and said just go on ahead and not to worry about him. So Wendy drove on, up into the mountains. Late that night he was right up at the top of the pass. He stopped to wonder whether he should wait for the boss after all. It was freezing cold, and if the new truck overheated and seized up with the long climb of broke down, the boss was going to be pretty uncomfortable. He'd even left his overcoat in the car. Wendy decided to wait where he was for a while. He got out one of the sleeping bags they'd brought in case they got stuck for the night somewhere, took off his shoes and his good trousers, and got into the sleeping bag for a snore off. He figured that the boss ought to be along in about an hour and a half, and so that he wouldn't oversleep. He dug out the new alarm clock they'd bought in Clinton, set it for 2 hours' time, and sat it on the open lid of the glove box. If the boss hadn't caught up by the time it went off, he'd go back and see what had happened to him. Then Wendy curled up on the front seat and slept. Some time later, the sound of a vehicle laboring up the hill woke him up. He sat up and listened. It sounded as though it could be the boss. There wasn't likely to be any other traffic over the road at this time of night. Wendy got out of the car so he could peel the sleeping bag off and get into his trousers, and when he opened the door, the beach ball rolled out on to the road. This beach ball, a great big thing with gaily colored stripes all over it, had been rolling off the stuff in the back of the car and getting in his way onto the front seat and round his feet. So he'd given up throwing it back where it came from and left it on the floor in the front. He threw the sleeping bag into the car and went to pick up the beach ball, but as he did, he accidentally kicked it with his foot. It shot 2 or 3 yards down the road and began to bounce and roll lightly down the slope. Wendy pranced after it in his socks, and just as he picked it up, the boss came round the corner and lit him up in the headlights of the new truck. Well, there was Wendy, standing in the middle of the road, 3,500 feet up in the mountains, snow and ice everywhere in the early hours of the morning, with no pants on and holding a great big multicolored beach ball. The vehicle behind the headlights stopped with a sudden skid. Then it pulled up beside the car in low gear. The boss stopped the motor and sat there looking at Wendy. "What are you doing?" he said after a while. "I was just going after this," said Wendy, holding up the beach ball. "What happened to your pants?" "I took them off in case they got creased." "I see. Well, don't you think you'd better put 'em back on again?" "I'll get them," said Wendy. He was just about blue and chattering with the cold by this time. He put the beach ball in the car and got his pants out and started climbing into them. Then the alarm clock went off. In the dark stillness it sounded like a set of chain harrows being dragged across a cattle stop. Wendy stood between the car and the truck, with one leg in his trousers and the other leg half in, while the alarm clock ran down, stopped, trickled out a few more diminishing rattles, and then stopped again. Wendy's estimate of when the boss was due to arrive had been pretty accurate, but the boss wasn't impressed. "What was that?" he said. "It's the new alarm clock," said Wendy. "I see," said the boss. "I set it so you so you wouldn't go past without me noticing," said Wendy. By this time he was starting to get a bit flustered. "Oh, I see. That's a very good idea, Wendy. Do you think you'll be all right to drive?" "Of course I am." "Okay then, we'd better push on. How are you getting on with those trousers?" Wendy finished putting his pants on and got into the car. "I think it might be a good idea not to get too far ahead from now on," called the boss. "There's a bad bit of road up ahead." Wendy started the car and jerked it nervously off along the windy descending road. He was still a bit numb with the cold when they arrived home about an hour after daylight. Life on the Neville's sheep farm was a little difficult for Wendy after that. The whole family had obviously been told about the beach ball episode. He had a couple of goes at trying to explain, but only managed to make it worse than ever. Not that they slung off about it or anything like that. In fact, they were very kind about it. Too kind, terribly kind. Whenever something went wrong, they'd say, "That's all right, Wendy. Don't you worry about it. That silly gate is always coming open like that. It should have been fixed long ago. You just run on up to the house and Miss Neville will make you a nice cup of tea. Or, no, don't bother to clean it up, Wendy. It's nothing. Really, one of the girls can see to it after dinner. There's plenty more in the pot. I'll just get you another plate. Or, I've been wondering when that was going to finally fall to pieces. You didn't hurt yourself, did you? That's good. Now, you just go and have a nice lie down for a while." Things like that. It made him feel about as useful round the place as a top-dressing hopper full of gorse and ragwort seed. And to top it off, it looked as though all the neighbors and visitors were being let in on the act. Stock agents and relatives of the family smiled and nodded understandingly. Children peered at him from around corners and ran for their lives, yelling their heads off when he spotted them. In the finish, he decided to tell them he was leaving. "Well, you know, you're perfectly welcome to stay here as long as you like, lad. But if you really want to leave, we are going to miss you, Wendy. A reference? No. Ah well, I'm sure you'll have no trouble getting another job wherever you want one. Chapter 3. The Odd Spot of Bother. It'd be terribly difficult to explain, and even more difficult to believe, but Wendy went from one unfortunate combination of circumstances to another. 12 months later, he was still running into the odd spot of bother. He'd run up against it in a town called Warwick, but he was getting pretty good at looking after himself by this time, and he managed to hang on for a week or so, living in the long grass and eating bread and tins of dog food. It's the cheapest meat you can get. Incidentally, in case you are ever stuck for a feed somewhere, until there was a vacancy at the water treatment plant. Then he moved into the single men's quarters and touched the foreman for a drag on his first week's wages to keep him going till payday. He came right in no time at all, and the work was nothing he couldn't handle. He stuck it out for about 6 weeks, and then, blow me down, if he didn't run into another bit of rotten luck. There was nothing he could have done about it either. They had to put 4 men off, and Wendy was the last one they'd taken on. They wrote on his employment card that he was temperamentally unsuited to this type of work, but that didn't matter now. Wendy fell on his feet this time. As a matter of fact, he'd bought himself some decent clothes and a second-hand suitcase, and this probably made a bit of difference. Anyway, he got another job, practically straight away, chauffeur gardener, with an old lady called Miss Dongle, who had a big 2-storied house, an enormous garden, a 4-year-old Hillman car that had done just over 3,000 miles, no husband, and poor eyesight. He ate in the big kitchen with the housekeeper, cook, Miss Willis, and slept in a little room on the end of the garage. Miss Dungle didn't work Wendy very hard, but on the other hand, she didn't pay him very hard either. At fortnight after he started, she gave him, when he tackled her about it, $8.19 and a perfectly good pair of overalls that only needed taking in a little round the legs and waist and shoulders. Wendy threw them under his bed. Next time he got $11.03 and was sent under the house to fish out a stone jar and a roll of linoleum with lots of wear left in it for his little room on the end of the garage. By the time he'd been there a couple of months, he could hardly move in his little room for the things he'd been paid with. There were 2 perfectly good old floor rugs, and most of the parts of a bicycle for him to work on wet days. There were 15 paint tins with some left in them, in case he wanted to paint something. A camp stretcher with only 1 torn place and 1 cracked leg, in case he wanted to go camping. A lovely old portrait of Queen Victoria that only needed a new glass. A pair of enormous jawed purrs, in case he wanted to go riding. A big brown book called True Manhood by Colonel Somebody or so other, a perfectly good, slightly chipped, blue enameled electric jug that only needed a new element to make it as good as new. There were books on how to breed roses and assemble kit-set aeroplanes and the stars. Almost in tears, she gave him an old mandolin to have done up and keep for as long as he stayed there. There was a tall ashtray and a short length of green plastic garden hose that had been caught in the lawn mower. Also, half a dozen or so assorted rolls of tattered wallpaper, in case he wanted to cover his collection of books. Apart from these and many other things, Wendy still considered that Miss Dungal owed him over $100 in wages. But Miss Dungal was either very shrewd or very hard up. Wendy tried putting some of the things she'd paid him with back under the house, but she started paying him with them again. 3 times he got a 2-cell torch that only needed batteries, a bulb, and a new glass to make it as good as brand new. She found it in the garage, where Wendy had hidden it behind some boards the first time, and then it was returned to her by the neighbor, who found it on his lawn. Wendy had thrown it into the hedge, but it must have gone right through. He didn't mind not being paid much money. He wasn't grasping or avaricious, but this was ridiculous. It was humiliating. So he bailed up Miss Dungal in the driveway one day and asked her straight out for the wages she owed him. And she surprised him by going into the house to get it. Then she surprised him again. She brought out a small box full of coins, all sorts of coins of every denomination and currency, except the one Wendy was interested in. He pointed out politely that it wasn't exactly what he'd asked her for, and she said it was much better for him to have his assets in something concrete, instead of ordinary money that could be stolen or squandered, and he said he didn't have much chance of turning the kind of assets she paid him with into anything useful. And she said that there was no need for him to. And he said, what about the $1,100 she owed Miss Willis in back wages over the past 2.5 years? Then she said that if he was going to complain about the way she paid him, he should have done it before he started. Wendy pointed out that he didn't know then that he was going to get a lot of junk instead of pay, and Miss Dungal said, "You accepted it, didn't you?" Wendy decided to turn the job in there and then, without notice. She didn't seem to mind. She even said she'd see what she could do about his holiday pay when he asked her what she was going to do about it. While he was packing his gear, she brought out a quaint old carpet sweeper, a car pump, and an empty binocular case. Wendy left them by the letterbox on his way out the gate. It was a bit late in the day to start looking around for another job, but there was one advertised in the newspaper that looked interesting. They wanted a single man of sober habits to apply in person for general maintenance work in a small orchard, comfortable living quarters, and above award rates, and it was only a mile from the center of the town. The money situation being what it was, Wendy decided it was worth giving it a try, just in case it wasn't taken. So he caught a bus out there and applied in person to the back door of a tidy little house surrounded by about 10 acres of apple and pear trees. The woman who came to the door greeted him very warmly indeed. No, the job hadn't been taken. Would he be interested in accepting it? Too right he would. They looked at what they could see of the orchard from where they were standing. "I was brought up among fruit trees," said Wendy. "My father's got about 50 acres of orchard at home." She took him through the porch and showed him the comfortable living quarters mentioned in the advertisement. They were luxurious by Wendy's standards. "The gentleman we had working here only left the day before yesterday, and I'm afraid we haven't had time to get the room done up nice," she apologized. "My sister is bringing some paint and curtain material home from the town this afternoon." "You don't want to worry about that," said Wendy. "There's nothing wrong with it the way it is. It'd do me anyway." "Then you'll take the position, Mr. Long, Wendy Long," said Wendy. This was a bit sudden. Do you want references or anything?" She put her hand on his sleeve. "You've got a nice face, Mr. Long, and that's the only reference I need. It's the face of a person who belongs to the Lord, and that's enough for me. I can always tell. I'm so glad you came to us, Mr. Long. It's very difficult to find the right kind of person these days. You've no idea." "That's very kind of you," said Wendy, wishing he hadn't lied about his old man having an orchard. "Wonderful. I just know you're going to fit in here. My sister will be so pleased. I know she will. When would you be able to start?" "Any time you like," said Wendy. "Right now'd do me. I've got everything I need to go on with in my suitcase. I could get the rest of my stuff sent on," he added, realizing how small the suitcase was. It was a bit overwhelming. Wendy wasn't accustomed to this kind of luck. She bustled him into the kitchen and sat him in a big armchair, insisting that they have a little something to eat because he must be very tired and hungry after coming all that way. She might have been a bit haywire on how far he'd come and how tired he was, but she was dead right about his being hungry. He'd missed out on lunch at Miss Dongle's place, and there was never enough to eat there at any time. This woman was a different hunk of work altogether. She scuttled back and forth, apologizing all the time for the scratchiness of the sumptuous variety of cold meats and pickles and bottled fruit she was loading onto the table. Wendy was fair drooling by the time it was ready. She sat him at one end of the table. "I'm afraid it's just a help-yourself kind of thing, Mr. Long," she apologized, "but we'll have a proper meal tonight when my sister gets home. I'll put the electric jug on," she added, going out of the room. Wendy buttered a couple of slices of fresh bread and helped himself to slices of cold beef mustard, sliced a tomato onto it, salt and pepper. She came in and sat opposite him just as he took the first beautiful big bite out of his sandwich. "Haven't you forgotten something, Mr. Long?" "Don't think so," said Wendy, looking around the table. "We always say grace before meals here," she said. "Would you like to offer up a few words of thanks for us? When you've finished what you are eating," she added. Wendy nearly choked on his mouthful of sandwich. "Hell," he spluttered, "I didn't know. I beg your pardon. Went down the wrong way," he said, patting his chest. "I didn't know you went in for saying grace. "How about you go first?" he suggested. "I've forgotten how it goes." She was silent for a few moments. Wendy waited for her to start, with his head bowed and his eyes shut and his sandwich ready in his hands. "I might as well tell you before you start working here, Mr. Long. We won't put up with any blasphemy while you're on this property." "Good on you," agreed Wendy, relieved that she'd changed the subject. "I'm not too keen on it myself. As a matter of fact, if I run across any, I'll root it out and hang it on the fence. I warn you, Mr. Long, unless you put a stop to this profanity, we won't be able to keep you on here. I just won't have it, and that's final. If it's getting out of control on you, I'll spray it for you. They reckon some of these hormone sprays they're putting out knock it back in no time." "How dare you?" "What's the matter?" said Wendy, looking to see if she'd eaten anything. "How dare you talk like that in my house?" "Like what?" "I warned you, Mr. Long. I won't have sacred things made light of in my house. Where do they come into it?" She stood up and looked grimly down across the table at him. "I can see you're not a very good Christian, Mr. Long. How do you make that out? No decent, God-fearing person could use that kind of talk ever." "But I'm not against religion, or anything like that," protested Wendy. "As a matter of fact, I come from a very religious family. One of my aunts took it up full-time, after my uncle snuffed it. Apparently you've got to do a fair bit of swatting up on it to get the most out of it," he went on conversationally, "but it pays off in the end. I know this aunt of mine used to get a hell of a kick out of it. I don't think it's going to work out satisfactorily after all, Mr. Long," she said in a tone that Wendy had heard somewhere before. "With us, God's word comes before anything else. We couldn't have anyone working here who treats it so lightly. I've been thinking of going in for it for a fair while, actually," said Wendy. "Please, Mr. Long, it's gone far enough." "Fair go," he said. "It's just that I've been a bit pushed for time, that's all. I'm sorry, Mr. Long, but my mind is made up. I have my sister to think of. It's out of the question." "But what about my face?" said Wendy desperately. "You said yourself it was God's face." For a moment there he thought he might have got her wavering, but he had no conception of the versatility of the word when it was supplemented by this woman's ability to dispense with reason and logic. "It's not your face, Mr. Long, it's your soul. It's in the devil's keeping, and unless you surrender yourself up to heavenly grace, you will perish in the everlasting flames of—" all right," said Wendy, getting up from the laden table and picking up his suitcase from beside the door. "I'm going." That was the shortest term of employment he'd had yet, a record that was unlikely to be broken even by Wendy himself. 3/4 of an hour between getting the job and getting the sack. He never even got to know his employer's name. All he'd got out of it was one mouthful of sandwich and a ravenous cheated hunger. He walked back to town. It wasn't far, and by the time he'd had an extravagant grill at a restaurant, it was getting on for bedtime. So he went round to Miss Dungall's place and sneaked into the little room on the end of the garage. Miss Willis had taken the sheets off the bed, but the blankets were folded neatly on the foot of it, and he had a very comfortable night. He could have slept there for several nights without anyone knowing, but he didn't need to. He had a stroke of luck. He walked straight into a job in a big service station right in the middle of town.